The wind howled like a banshee clawing at the stagecoach with icy talons. Inside, huddled against the biting cold, Ruth clutched her satchel, the worn leather a poor shield against the blizzard's fury. They were hours overdue, lost in a world of swirling white. But the cold was not the only predator stalking them on that desolate mountain pass. A shadow fell across the window, a figure darker than the storm itself. The door ripped open, revealing a man whose eyes held the chilling emptiness of the winter landscape. He was the outlaw who would rob her of everything she owned. He was also the only man who could save her life. The year of our Lord, 1888, was to be a year of new beginnings for Ruth Josephine Hayes. With the recent passing of her father, the Kansas prairie held nothing for her but memories tinged with sorrow. California, however, shimmered on the horizon, a golden promise of a new life. A schoolteacher by trade, possessed of a quiet strength forged by prairie life. She had packed her meager belongings, said her tearful goodbyes, and embarked on the arduous journey west to a small but growing town in the Sacramento Valley. The stagecoach, a sturdy but weathered vessel of wood and leather, groaned under the strain of its 6 passengers, each a thread in the vast tapestry of westward expansion. Ruth, a woman of 24, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes the hue of a summer sky, sat wedged between Bartholomew Barty Higgins and Mrs. Agatha Blackwood. Higgins was a portly, perspiring salesman, reeking of cheap cigars, his booming voice determined to fill every silence with questionable anecdotes of his business triumphs. Mrs. Blackwood, in stark contrast, was a statue of grief clad in widow's weeds, her silence as profound as the snow-dusted peaks of the Sierra Nevadas they were ascending. Across from them sat the young, bright-eyed Millers. Their hands intertwined, their faces alight with the dreams of a shared future. They spoke in whispers of the land they had purchased, the home they would build, the children they would raise. In the corner sat a man who had introduced himself only as Jones, a prospector with a grizzled beard and a glint in his eye that spoke of gold fever and long, lonely nights under the vast, star-strewn sky. The journey had been long. Days of bone-jarring travel across dusty plains had given way to the increasingly challenging ascent into the mountains. The air grew thinner, colder, and the vibrant greens and earthy browns of the lowlands were gradually replaced by the stark, monochromatic beauty of a winter landscape. Their driver, a grizzled veteran of the trail named Jedediah, had grown progressively quieter as they climbed higher. His usual jovial banter had been replaced by a grim-faced concentration, his eyes constantly scanning the darkening sky. "Storm's brewin'," he had muttered that morning, his words nearly stolen by the wind. "A bad one, I reckon. We need to make it to the next way station before she hits." But the storm, it seemed, was impatient. It descended upon them with a sudden savage fury, a white-out blizzard that erased the world, leaving only a swirling vortex of snow and wind. The temperature plummeted, and the once sturdy stagecoach felt like a child's toy in the grip of a giant. Inside the carriage, the mood had soured. The initial camaraderie had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing fear that tightened its icy grip around their hearts. Barty Higgins's boisterous laughter had died in his throat, his face now a pasty white. The young Mrs. Miller started to cry her sobs, a heart-breaking counterpoint to the storm's fury. The stagecoach lurched violently, throwing the passengers against one another, and then shuddered to a final grinding halt. Jedediah's muffled shouts from outside were barely audible over the roar of the wind. "We're stuck, Jones the prospector," stated the obvious, his voice a low growl. "Snow's too deep," Horses can't pull us through." Panic, a venomous serpent, began to uncoil in the cramped carriage. Ruth closed her eyes, offering a silent prayer, summoning the memory of her father's unwavering faith. He had always told her that fear was a shadow, and the only way to defeat it was to face it with a steady heart. It was in that moment of desperate supplication with the world outside, reduced to a maelstrom of white, that the shadow fell across the window. The door was wrenched open, with a violent splintering of wood, and a blast of frigid air and snow invaded their fragile sanctuary. Framed in the doorway, a figure stood, a spectre of the storm. A man whose presence seemed to command the very elements. He was tall and broad-shouldered, clad in a heavy, snow-dusted duster. A black bandana covered the lower half of his face, and a wide-brimmed hat, pulled low, cast his eyes in shadow. But the twin barrels of the shotgun he held, steady and unwavering, needed no introduction. "Evenin', folks." The outlaw's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate in Ruth's very bones. "Sorry to interrupt your travels. Now, if you'll all be so kind as to hand over your valuables, we can make this quick and painless." His eyes, the only part of his face visible above the bandana, moved over the passengers, cold and appraising. They were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, a startling pale gray that seemed to see right through them to the very core of their fear. And as those eyes met hers, a jolt like a bolt of lightning shot through Ruth. It was a strange, inexplicable sensation, a flicker of recognition in the heart of terror. In the heart of a blizzard, in the midst of a robbery. Ruth Josephine Hayes had come face to face with a destiny as wild and unpredictable as the land she had come to conquer. The outlaw's presence filled the cramped coach, a palpable force that seemed to suck the very air from their lungs. The shotgun, a brutal extension of his will, remained leveled at the passengers, its twin muzzles like dark, unblinking eyes. Barty Higgins, his bravado a distant memory, was the first to comply. With trembling hands he fumbled for his wallet, his gold watch a diamond stick pin from his cravat. He practically threw them at the outlaw, his desperation a pathetic display. "Take it all," he whimpered, his voice a reedy whine. Just don't hurt us." The outlaw said nothing, his silence more unnerving than any threat. He gestured with the shotgun barrel towards a worn leather sack he had tossed onto the floor. Higgins, eager to please, scrambled to deposit his worldly goods into its waiting maw. Next, the Millers, their faces streaked with tears, offered up what little they had. A small pouch of coins, a locket containing a miniature portrait of the young woman's mother, and her silver wedding band, which she slid from her finger with a sob. The outlaw's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, as he looked at them, a fleeting, almost imperceptible flicker of something that might have been pity. Mrs. Blackwood, her face a mask of icy composure, removed a simple, elegant silver brooch from her collar and dropped it into the sack. Her movements were deliberate, almost defiant, as if she were a queen surrendering a token to a commoner. She met the outlaw's gaze with a look of such profound, world-weary sorrow that it seemed to give him pause. Jones, the prospector, surrendered a small, heavy pouch that clinked with the promise of gold dust, the fruits of his long and arduous labor. A flicker of anger, hot and brief, flashed in his eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by the cold, hard reality of the situation. Finally, the outlaw's gaze settled on Ruth. She met his stare, her heart a wild bird fluttering in her chest, but her hands were steady as she reached for her satchel. Inside, nestled amongst her few personal belongings, was a small velvet-lined box. It contained the last vestiges of her inheritance, a string of pearls that had belonged to her mother, and a small, intricately carved gold locket that held a lock of her father's hair. She hesitated the sentimental value of these items, far outweighing their monetary worth. They were tangible links to her past, to the love that had shaped her, the memories that sustained her. To surrender them felt like a betrayal. The outlaw seemed to sense her hesitation. He took a step closer, his presence looming over her. The scent of pine and cold, clean air clung to him, a strangely intimate detail in the midst of her terror. "Everything," he said, his voice a low, insistent command. With a heavy heart, Ruth placed the velvet box in the sack. As she did, her fingers brushed against his, and another jolt as sharp and unexpected as the first shot through her. It was a fleeting, accidental contact, but it was enough to make her breath catch in her throat. His eyes, those startling, pale grey orbs, met hers again, and this time she saw something else in their depths. Surprise, perhaps, or even recognition. It was a silent, unspoken question that hung in the frigid air between them. He straightened up his gaze, breaking from hers, and turned his attention to the front of the coach, the strongbox. He said his voice addressed to no one in particular, but his gaze was fixed on the space beneath the driver's seat. Jedediah, who had been standing just outside his hands, raised his face, a grim mask of resignation, spoke up. "It's bolted to the floor. You'll need a crowbar." The outlaw nodded, as if he had expected this. He reached into his duster and produced a long, wicked-looking knife. With a few swift, practiced movements, he pried open the lid of the strongbox, revealing several canvas bags filled with coins and a stack of banknotes. He quickly transferred the money to his own sack, his movements efficient and economical. A sudden, violent gust of wind tore at the stagecoach, sending a shower of snow and ice through the open door. The horses, already skittish, whinnied in terror. The outlaw cursed under his breath. He glanced out at the blizzard, his face a mask of grim concern. "This storm. It's worse than I thought," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. His task finished, his sack now bulging. He slung it over his shoulder. He turned to leave, but paused, his hand on the splintered frame of the door, and looked back. His gaze fell on Ruth once more, and this time there was no mistaking the look in his eyes. It was a look of regret, a flicker of a conscience he had tried to suppress. He seemed on the verge of speaking, but then he shook his head as if to clear it of some unwelcome thought, pulled his hat down lower, and stepped out into the storm, disappearing into the swirling white as quickly as he had appeared. The trapper's cabin, when they finally stumbled upon it, was a sight for sore, frozen eyes. Jedediah, his face a mask of grim determination, had managed to navigate the treacherous pass, his knowledge of the mountains, their only guide. The cabin was a small, crudely built log hut, but to the weary, frost-bitten passengers, it was a palace. Inside it was cold and dark, but it was a refuge from the relentless wind. Jones, with his practical, no-nonsense approach, quickly set about building a fire in the stone hearth. The crackle of the flames and the warm orange glow that pushed back the darkness was the most beautiful thing Ruth had ever experienced. They huddled together, a small, disparate group of strangers united by terror. The initial relief of finding shelter soon gave way to the grim reality of their situation. They were stranded with no food, no supplies, and no way of knowing when or if help would arrive. The blizzard raged on, piling snow against the door and windows, threatening to entomb them. As the hours stretched into a long, terrifying night, their meager hopes began to dwindle. The fire, their only source of warmth, was a hungry beast, and their supply of firewood was finite. Barty Higgins, his initial bluster long gone, had been reduced to a whimpering, self-pitying wreck. He complained incessantly about the cold, the hunger, the injustice of it all, his whining grating on their frayed nerves. The young Mrs. Miller. Sarah had developed a hacking cough, a dry, rattling sound that echoed in the small spaces between the wind's howls. Mrs. Blackwood sat staring into the fire, her silence a heavy, oppressive presence. Ruth, her own fear a cold, hard knot in her stomach, tried to remain practical. But as the night wore on, even her resolve began to crumble. The cold was a relentless, insidious enemy, seeping into their bones, stealing their strength and their will to survive. It was Jones who finally voiced the thought lurking in all their minds. "We're not going to make it," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Not like this. The storm's not letting up. We'll be buried in here by morning." A heavy, suffocating silence fell, broken only by Sarah Miller's coughing. It was in that moment of shared despair that a new sound reached them, a faint rhythmic thumping from the roof, followed by a scraping, scratching noise, as if someone or something was trying to get in. Fear, cold and primal, gripped them. Jedediah. His face pale but resolute, reached for the old shotgun he had managed to salvage from the coach. The scraping stopped. Then a voice that was both familiar and terrifying, cut through the howl of the wind. "Hello in there. Anyone alive?" It was him, the outlaw. A wave of anger, hot and fierce, surged through Ruth. "How dare he? Who's there?" Jedediah called out, his shotgun raised. "A friend." The outlaw's voice replied, a hint of wry amusement in his tone. Or at least someone who's not a fan of freezing to death. There was the sound of something heavy being dropped onto the snow. "I've got food," his voice continued. "And firewood. And a proposition." Food. Firewood. The words hung in the air, a tantalizing temptation. He was offering them life. "What do you want?" Jedediah's voice was filled with suspicion. "To come in," the outlaw replied. "Before this storm buries us both. I'm not asking for a pardon, just a truce. A temporary one, until the storm passes. A truce." The passengers looked at each other, their faces a mixture of fear, anger, and a desperate, gnawing hope. To let him in felt like a betrayal, but to refuse was a death sentence. It was Ruth who made the decision. She rose, her legs unsteady, and walked towards the door. "Let him in," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Jedediah looked at her, his face a mask of disbelief. "Are you crazy, woman? He's a thief, a cold-blooded killer for all we know. He's also our only chance," Ruth replied, her gaze unwavering. "We're not going to survive another night like this, and right now, I'm willing to make a deal with the devil himself if it means seeing the sunrise." There was a long, tense silence. Slowly, reluctantly, Jedediah lowered his shotgun. With a deep breath, Ruth reached for the wooden latch and lifted it. The door creaked open, and a blast of frigid air and snow filled the cabin. He stepped inside, a specter of the storm, carrying a lantern, a bulging canvas sack, and a bundle of firewood. The small cabin seemed to shrink, the air crackling with tension. He pulled down his bandana. He was younger than she had expected, with a strong, square jaw and a weathered face. A small white scar cut through his left eyebrow. But it was his eyes that held her captive, those startling, pale grey eyes that seemed to see right through her. "The name's Holden," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Holden Kane." and it looks like we're going to be neighbors. For a little while, at least. The presence of Holden Kane in the small cabin was a catalyst, a spark thrown into a tinderbox of fear and desperation. The air, already thick with the scent of wood smoke and unwashed bodies, now crackled with a new unspoken tension, a fragile truce hanging precariously in the balance. The other passengers watched his every move with overt suspicion. Barty Higgins seemed on the verge of making a scene, but a single cold glance from Holden was enough to silence him. Holden, for his part, seemed oblivious to the turmoil. He moved with a quiet, efficient grace, a man at home in the wild. He deposited his sack of supplies on the floor and set about adding wood to the fire. The flames leaped up a hungry, grateful beast, and the cabin was filled with a new, more potent warmth that seemed to seep into their very bones. From his sack, he produced a side of bacon, a bag of coffee, a tin of beans, and a small cast-iron skillet. The sight and smell of the food cooking was an almost unbearable temptation. Their stomachs, which had been gnawing at them for hours, now roared in protest. Holden seemed to take no notice. He cooked in silence, his face a mask of concentration. When the food was ready, he divided it amongst them, his portions fair and equal. They ate in silence, a meal not of camaraderie, but of primal instinctive survival. After they had eaten, a semblance of strength and hope returned. But the memory of the robbery was still fresh in their minds. He was their savior, but he was also their captor. Ruth found herself watching him, trying to piece together the puzzle of the man who had so violently and unexpectedly entered her life. As the night wore on, the storm continued to rage. Sarah Miller, the young wife, was seized by a violent fit of coughing. It was a deep, racking sound that left her weak and breathless. Her husband, his face a mask of helpless terror, could only hold her. Holden, who had been sitting by the fire, rose and walked over to the young couple. He knelt beside Sarah, his touch surprisingly gentle as he felt her forehead. "She's burning up," he said, his voice a low, concerned rumble. The cold, it settled in her lungs. He rummaged through his sack and produced a small leather-bound pouch. From it, he took a pinch of dried herbs, their earthy scent filling the cabin. He mixed the herbs with hot water from the kettle. "It's an old remedy," he said to the worried husband. "My mother, she used to make it for me when I was a boy. It'll help with the fever and the cough." He held the cup to Sarah's lips, his hand steady. She drank it down her eyes, never leaving his face a look of trust and gratitude in their depths. Ruth watched the scene unfold, a strange warmth spreading through her chest. It was a moment of tenderness, of compassion, a chink in his armor. Later that night, as the others slept a fitful, exhausted sleep, Ruth found herself unable to rest. She rose from her makeshift bed and walked over to the fire, where Holden sat a solitary figure in the flickering light. He looked up as she approached. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice a quiet whisper. He nodded, his gaze returning to the fire. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, a silence filled with 1,000 unspoken words. It was Ruth who finally broke it. Why, she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you come back?" He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the fire as if searching for the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly rumble filled with a weariness that seemed to go beyond the physical. "I'm not a monster, Ruth," he said, his use of her name sending a strange shiver down her spine. "I'm a thief, a scoundrel, a man who has done things he's not proud of. But I'm not a killer. I don't leave people to die." He turned to look at her. His eyes, those startling, pale grey orbs, filled with a raw, unguarded emotion that took her breath away. When I left you, when I rode out into that storm, I couldn't get your face out of my mind, he confessed, his voice low and intimate. Your eyes, they were so disappointed. Not angry, not scared, just disappointed, as if you had expected better of me. He paused, a flicker of a self-deprecating smile touching his lips. And the truth is, I expected better of myself. Ruth didn't know what to say. His words had stripped away the last of her anger, leaving her with a strange, unsettling mix of pity and something else. I'm a man who is running from his past. He continued, his voice a ragged whisper. A past that is as relentless and unforgiving as this storm. And sometimes I get so tired of running. He fell silent. Ruth found herself reaching out her hand, resting on his arm. It was a small, instinctive gesture of comfort. He looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise, as if he were not used to human touch. In that moment, something shifted between them. The lines that had once separated them began to blur. They were no longer an outlaw and a school teacher. They were just two people, two souls stranded in a blizzard, finding a fragile, unexpected connection. The storm, a relentless white-fanged beast, held them captive for 3 long days and 3 even longer nights. The small cabin, which had at first seemed a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, a cramped, claustrophobic space that amplified their fears and anxieties. But inside the cabin, the truce between Holden and the passengers had evolved into a strange, unspoken camaraderie. The initial fear had been replaced by a grudging respect for the man who had, against all odds, become their protector. Holden, for his part, had shed the hardened exterior of the outlaw, revealing a man of quiet strength and unexpected kindness. He had taken charge of their small group, his leadership not one of command but of quiet competence. He rationed their dwindling supplies with a fair hand, his decisions unquestioned. He tended to the sick, kept the fire going, and maintained a sense of order in their chaotic world. It was in his interactions with Ruth that the true man was revealed. They fell into a comfortable, easy rhythm, a silent partnership. They worked together, their movements synchronized. They cooked together, their hands brushing as they passed, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt of electricity through them. In the quiet hours of the long nights they talked. He told her of his childhood, a life of poverty in Tennessee, of a drunkard father and a sainted mother. He spoke of his dreams, his hopes, his regrets of the man he had once been and had lost somewhere along the way. Ruth in turn told him of her life, her love of learning, her passion for teaching, and her dreams of California. She told him of her father, a man of quiet courage who had taught her to see the good in everyone, even in a man with a past as dark as Holden Kane's. As they shared their stories, the walls between them crumbled, dissolving until there was nothing left but a raw, unguarded intimacy, a connection as deep as it was unexpected. On the 3rd night of the storm, as the others slept, their fragile connection finally blossomed into something more. They were sitting by the fire, the only 2 souls awake, their shoulders almost touching, their silence a comfortable embrace. "I should hate you, Ruth," said her voice, a quiet whisper, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "You robbed me. You took everything I had." Holden was silent for a long moment, his face a mask of profound sorrow. "I know," he said, his voice ragged, "and I'll never be able to forgive myself for that. But I hope that someday you'll be able to forgive me." He turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a raw emotion that took her breath away. Because the truth is, Ruth, he confessed, his voice low and intimate, the truth is, I think I'm falling in love with you. His words, his confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, beautiful thing. Ruth's heart, which had been a wild, fluttering bird, suddenly stilled. She looked at him, at the man who had robbed her, saved her, and in the space of a few short days captured her heart. And in that moment, she knew with a certainty that defied all logic that she was falling in love with him too. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The gentle, tremulous smile that touched her lips was all the answer he needed. He reached out his calloused, work-worn hand, gently cupping her face. His thumb, rough and tender, traced the line of her jaw, sending a shiver of delight down her spine. He leaned in his lips, meeting hers, in a kiss that was both tentative and passionate, a kiss that was a promise, a question, a declaration. It was a kiss that was shattered by a sudden, violent pounding on the door, a sound that ripped through the silence. They sprang apart, their hearts pounding. The pounding came again, louder, more insistent, followed by a voice that was both familiar and terrifying, a voice that sent a chill of dread down Holden's spine. Holden. Holden Kane. I know you're in there. Open up, you double-crossing son of a bitch. It was the voice of a man from his past, a man he had hoped to never see again. It was the voice of his former partner, a ruthless, cold-blooded killer named Jebediah Jed Stone. The past had returned. The storm that had brought them together was about to become the least of their worries. Jebediah Stone's voice was a death knell. The name itself was a curse, a name whispered in hushed, fearful tones across the territory. He was a man with a reputation for a cruelty as vast and unforgiving as the wilderness he roamed. Holden's face, which had been softened by the warmth of Ruth's love, now hardened into a mask of grim, deadly resolve. The outlaw, the man he had been trying to leave behind, was back. "Get down!" he hissed to the others, his voice a low, urgent command. He grabbed his Colt peacemaker and moved towards the door, his movements silent, the movements of a predator. Outside, Jed Stone's voice, a gravelly, impatient growl, cut through the howl of the wind. I know you're in there. Kane, I can smell your fear. You thought you could just ride off into the sunset with my money, did you? You thought you could just disappear. Well, you thought wrong. Holden's mind raced. He had betrayed Jed, yes, but it was a betrayal born of a desperate attempt to escape a life of violence that was destroying his soul. He had taken his share of the loot from their last robbery and had ridden off into the night, hoping to start a new life. But the past had a long, tenacious reach. I've got your little playmates out here with me. Kane. Jed's voice was a cruel, taunting sneer. The ones you left to freeze in that stagecoach. They told me everything. They told me how you played the hero. Well, their hero is about to get them all killed. A cold, sickening dread washed over Holden. He risked a quick glance out the small, grimy window. In the faint moonlight, he could see them huddled together, their faces pale with terror. Jed and his men, a rough, brutal-looking bunch, had them at gunpoint. He was trapped. If he fought, they would all be killed. If he surrendered, he would be killed, and the others... He shuddered to think what Jed would do to them, especially to Ruth. She came to his side, her face pale but resolute, her eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering love. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. He looked at her, at the woman who had become his everything, and a new, desperate resolve took hold of him. He would not let her die. "There's only one thing we can do," he said, his voice a low, determined whisper. "We fight." It was a suicidal plan, a desperate gamble against impossible odds. He explained it in quick, urgent whispers. Jedediah, his face a mask of grim determination, nodded his agreement. Jones, his eyes glinting with a cold, hard anger, also agreed. Holden turned to Ruth, his eyes filled with a love so fierce it took her breath away. "Stay here," he commanded. "Stay down. And no matter what happens, don't come out." He kissed her a hard, desperate kiss that was both a promise and a farewell. Then he was gone, a shadow moving towards the back of the cabin, where a small, boarded-up window offered a slim chance of escape. With a strength born of desperation, he pried open the window and slipped out into the storm. He circled the cabin, his movements silent and stealthy. Positioning himself behind a large, snow-covered pine, he took a deep, steadying breath and then let out a loud, piercing whistle, the prearranged signal. Inside the cabin, Jedediah, with a roar of defiance, kicked open the door and charged out, his shotgun blazing. The sudden, unexpected attack threw Jed's men into confusion. In that moment of chaos, Holden opened fire. His first shot took out the man closest to the hostages. His second took out another of Jed's men, who was raising his rifle. The night erupted into a maelstrom of gunfire, shouts, and screams. Jones, with surprising agility, had also joined the fray, his own pistol barking. Even Barty Higgins, armed with a piece of firewood, had charged into the battle, a comical, unlikely warrior. But it was Holden who was the true force of nature, a whirlwind of deadly, efficient violence. He moved with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying, his pistol a seamless extension of his will. Jed Stone, his face a mask of furious disbelief, finally realized what was happening. He let out a roar of rage and turned his attention to Holden, his own pistol blazing. The two men, old partners and mortal enemies, were now locked in a deadly duel. Their bullets whizzed past each other in the dark. They were both skilled gunmen, both determined to be the last man standing. But Holden had something that Jed did not. He had something to fight for. He had Ruth. It was that thought that gave him the edge. He saw an opening dove to the side, rolling in the snow, and came up firing. His last bullet found its mark in Jed Stone's chest. Jed staggered back, a look of shocked surprise on his face. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his shirt, and then up at Holden. "You always were the lucky one, Kane." He gasped, his voice a ragged, bloody whisper, and then he fell his body, disappearing into the soft, white embrace of the snow. A profound silence descended. It was over. Ruth, her heart in her throat, rushed out of the cabin and into Holden's arms. "It's over," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. But as they stood there, a new sound reached them. The sound of approaching horses, of shouting men. A posse. A lawman's posse. And they were heading straight for them. The arrival of the posse, a dark, formidable line of horsemen emerging from the swirling snow, transformed the scene of their hard-won victory into a new kind of battlefield. The relief that had flooded through Ruth was instantly replaced by a cold dread. At the head of the posse was a man whose presence commanded an immediate, unyielding authority. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered and stern. A silver star, glinting dully in the pre-dawn light, was pinned to his heavy wool coat. This was Marshal Clayton Royce, a man whose name was synonymous with justice in the untamed territories. His eyes, the color of chipped slate, missed nothing. His gaze swept over the scene, the bodies, the smoking guns, the exhausted survivors, and finally it settled on Holden. There was no flicker of surprise, only a grim, weary recognition. "Holden Kane." Marshal Royce's voice was a low, powerful rumble. "I should have known I'd find you in the middle of a mess like this. It seems trouble follows you like a shadow." Holden didn't move. He simply stood his ground. Ruth's hand held tightly in his face a mask of weary resignation. Marshal Holden acknowledged with a curt nod. Royce dismounted. What happened here? He demanded, his gaze taking in the carnage. It was Jedediah who spoke up first, his voice raspy but firm. He recounted the events of the past few days, the robbery, the blizzard, being stranded, and Holden's return. He told them how Holden had saved them, sharing his food and supplies, nursing the sick. "He saved our lives." Marshal Jedediah finished, his voice thick with a conviction that surprised even Ruth. "Every last one of us would be dead if it weren't for him." Jones, the prospector, added his own account, his words gruff but clear. "The man's a thief, no doubt about that. But he's also a man of his word. He fought for us. He fought like a demon when Stone's gang showed up." Marshal Royce listened impassively, his expression unreadable. His gaze shifted from the passengers to the bodies, his eyes lingering on the face of Jedediah Stone. He nudged the body with the toe of his boot. "Jedediah Stone," he muttered. "Been chasing this piece of work for 5 years. There's a $1,000 bounty on his head. Dead or alive?" A flicker of something crossed the marshal's face as he looked back at Holden. "You took down Jed Stone. Not many men can say that." "He gave me no choice," Holden said, his voice flat. "The law is the law, Kane." Royce said, his voice hardening again. "You've got a price on your own head. Bank robbery in Nevada. There's a warrant out for your arrest." Ruth's heart clenched. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "Marshal, please. You can't take him. He may have broken the law, but he's a good man. He saved us. He deserves a chance." Royce's gaze softened for a fraction of a second. "Ma'am," he said, his voice not unkind, "the law doesn't deal in chances. It deals in facts. And the fact is, Holden Kane is a wanted man." He turned to his deputies. "Take him." 2 deputies moved forward. Holden didn't resist. He gave Ruth's hand one last desperate squeeze. "It's all right, Ruth," he whispered, his voice for her ears only. "It's time to stop running." As they bound his hands, a wave of despair so profound it threatened to swallow Ruth whole. It was then that Mrs. Agatha Blackwood, the silent, grieving widow, finally spoke. Her voice, though quiet, cut through the cold morning air with an unexpected authority. "Marshal Royce, you will not take that man?" The marshal raised an eyebrow. "And who are you to tell me my business, ma'am?" "My name," she said, her voice clear and ringing, "is Agatha Blackwood. My late husband was Senator Alistair Blackwood of California." A murmur went through the posse. The name carried weight. Royce's demeanor shifted to cautious deference. "Senator Blackwood's widow. My apologies, ma'am." "My husband," she continued. Her voice, gaining strength, was a man who believed in justice, but he also believed in redemption. He believed that a man's past should not define his future. She turned her gaze on Holden. "This man, Holden Kane, is not the man you think he is. He is a man who made a mistake, a man who is trying to atone for that mistake." He saved my life. He saved all of our lives, and I will not stand by and watch you condemn him for a past he is trying so desperately to escape." She turned back to the marshal, her eyes blazing. "I am on my way to Sacramento to see the governor, and I will speak to him about this matter. I will tell him of this man's courage. I will tell him that Holden Kane is not a criminal. He is a hero. And I will demand a full pardon for him." A stunned silence fell. Marshal Royce was a man caught between the letter of the law and a powerful story of redemption. He looked at Holden, at Ruth, at the other survivors, and at the fierce determination in Mrs. Blackwood's eyes. He was silent for a long time. "All right, ma'am," he said. Finally his voice a low, reluctant rumble. "I'll hold off on taking him to the territorial prison. We'll escort you all to the nearest town to Carson City, and we'll see what the governor has to say." He turned to his deputies. "Uncuff him." It was not a victory, not yet. But it was a reprieve. It was a chance. It was hope. The journey to Carson City was a strange and surreal procession. The remnants of the Stagecoach party, now under the watchful escort of Marshal Royce and his posse, descended from the snow-choked mountains into the sprawling, sage-dusted plains of Nevada. The stark white of the blizzard gave way to the muted browns and grays of the high desert, a landscape that seemed to reflect the uncertain transitional nature of their own lives. The atmosphere among the survivors was a curious mix of exhaustion, relief, and a tense, hopeful anticipation. They were no longer a random collection of strangers, but a small, tightly knit unit, bound by the shared trauma of their ordeal and the unlikely heroism of the man who rode in their midst. Holden was a changed man. The hard-guarded mask of the outlaw had been stripped away, replaced by a quiet, thoughtful introspection. He rode beside Ruth, their hands often finding each other in a small, reassuring touch. Their silences filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. He was a man in limbo, his fate hanging on the whims of a governor and the persuasive power of a grieving widow. Mrs. Agatha Blackwood, having shed her cloak of silent sorrow, had become a formidable force. She rode with a newfound purpose, her conversations with Marshal Royce filled with a quiet, steely determination. She spoke of her late husband's political philosophies, of the importance of tempering justice with mercy, her words weaving a powerful argument for Holden's redemption. Royce, for his part, listened with a growing respect. When they finally arrived in Carson City, a bustling, chaotic hub of silver miners, gamblers, and politicians, the story of their survival had already preceded them. The tale of the blizzard. The robbery and the dramatic showdown with the notorious Jebediah Stone gang had become the stuff of local legend. Holden Kane, the outlaw, had become Holden Kane, the folk hero. The fact that he had also robbed them was a detail that was conveniently and increasingly overlooked. Mrs. Blackwood, true to her word, immediately sought an audience with the governor. While they waited for the governor's decision, the survivors were put up in the finest hotel in Carson City. For Ruth and Holden, these days were a precious stolen time. They walked the dusty streets, two people from different worlds, their love a fragile, beautiful thing forged in a storm. They talked of the future, a future that was still a question mark. And if he says no? Ruth asked one evening, as they stood on a bluff overlooking the city, the setting sun painting the desert sky in hues of orange and purple. Holden was silent for a long time. "Then I'll serve my time," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll pay my debt. And when I get out, if you'll still have me, I'll come and find you." Ruth's heart ached, but she knew he was a man of honor. "I'll wait for you," she said, her voice a fierce, unwavering promise. No matter how long it takes. The governor's decision came 3 days later. Mrs. Blackwood, her face alight with a triumphant smile, summoned them all to her hotel suite. The governor, a man of political savvy and a keen understanding of public opinion, had been swayed not only by Mrs. Blackwood's passionate plea, but by the overwhelming tide of public support. In consideration of his role in the demise of the Jebediah Stone gang, and in light of the testimony of the survivors, he had issued a full and unconditional pardon for Holden Kane. A collective gasp of joy and relief filled the room. Ruth, her eyes filled with tears, threw her arms around Holden, her heart overflowing with a happiness so profound it was almost painful. The past was forgiven. The future was theirs. But there was one more twist. A young, nervous-looking telegraph boy arrived with a message for Holden. It was from a law firm in St. Louis. It informed him that his estranged grandfather, a wealthy, eccentric man, whom Holden had not seen since he was a boy, had recently passed away. And in a final unexpected act of reconciliation, he had left the entirety of his considerable fortune to his only living heir, Holden Kane. The outlaw, the man who had been a penniless fugitive just a few short weeks ago, was now a wealthy man. A few months later, in a small, newly built church in the Sacramento Valley, Ruth Josephine Hayes became Ruth Josephine Kane. The wedding was a simple, beautiful affair, attended by the small, unlikely family they had forged in the heart of a blizzard, Mrs. Blackwood, who had found a new purpose, Jedediah, who had retired to work as foreman on their newly purchased ranch, Jones, who had struck silver and become their business partner, and the Millers, whose own small farm was flourishing. Holden Kane, the outlaw, was gone. In his place was a man who had found his redemption not in a governor's pardon or an unexpected inheritance, but in the love of a good woman and the quiet, simple life of a rancher. He never forgot the man he had been, but he no longer ran from his past. He had faced it, conquered it, and emerged a better, stronger man. And sometimes on a cold winter's night, when the wind howled around their home, he would pull Ruth close and tell her the story of the outlaw who had robbed her stagecoach and returned to save her life. It was a story of a blizzard, but more than that, it was a story of a love as woot and enduring as the West itself. And there you have it, the incredible, true-to-life drama of Ruth and Holden. A story that proves that even in the harshest of winters, the most unexpected love can bloom. It's a testament to the fact that our pasts don't have to define our futures, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the heart of the storm. If their story of survival, redemption, and unlikely love resonated with you, if it reminded you that there's a little bit of the Wild West in all of our hearts, then please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a story with real grit and heart, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales of history, drama, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Your support allows us to keep these stories alive. Until next time, keep searching for the hero in the outlaw.